Welcome to the lecture on global scope and internationalization. And let's get into it. So we're going to talk about global scope and the who, what, which, how, and where of expansion, and specifically talk about distance, why that's important. You might remember from the previous lecture about horizontal and vertical scope that we were talking about the first two things here. Horizontal integration, which is also called diversification, is when a firm thinks about the range of products and services it can offer. The way that a firm determines the scope of horizontal scope is by resource relatedness. If it is a highly specific resource, then the horizontal expansion will be narrow. In the last lecture, I used the example of a company having intellectual property in the form of a specific titanium alloy. There are not an infinite number of applications of titanium alloys. Right, so there might only be certain kinds of products you can expand to in which this particular resource can be utilized. So in this particular example, the company started off making shielding for satellites with titanium, and then it might expand to making artificial hips out of titanium. All right. And next we have is vertical integration. I mentioned that the key thing to think about is value chain. Right? The firm considers what part of the value chain it wants to operate in, and I said the motivation there is transaction costs or make or buy decision. If it's cheaper to buy the thing on the open market, then you may not want to make it in-house. IKEA may not make its own screws. Right? That's a fairly standard part and there's no real advantage. Okay? In this instance, in making a house. However, if the cost of doing something in the firm are cheaper than sourcing it on the open market, then you'd want to vertically integrate. Okay. Some reasons that you would want to vertically integrate: diversification of products, customers, and risk. Remember, horizontal integration is all about the act of diversification. Okay. And then there are reasons that a firm would vertically integrate. The market's too risky. Okay. You want to reduce supplier power. The market's young and you need to develop the market. And the assets are highly specific. But some of you had some questions. So I thought I would add just some other reasons to make it more explicit why firms vertically integrate, and some of these relate to those things on the other side, right? Okay. Vertically integrating can provide market power in terms of barriers to entry. Okay. You force anyone else trying to come into that space, they'd have to vertically integrate. Okay, it provides some downstream price maintenance, but also gives you a little power upstream, right? Because it reduces your costs. You can use it to secure critical supplies, things that you have to have in order to, make your products. Okay, it could be an efficiency thing. By vertically integrating and having a tighter control of another part of the value chain, it can be more efficient for you to actually make your products. Okay, you can potentially improve their quality. Remember, I also said that there are certain circumstances under which that might actually negatively impact your quality. But it will definitely facilitate scheduling and planning. It'd be much easier if you know when your inputs are going to arrive at the next stage of production. Okay, then the idea of facilitating investments in specific assets, okay? And there's a couple of kinds of specificity that I wanted to talk to you about, okay? Site specificity means that an asset is impossible or prohibitively expensive to have or move to another location. If you're an electric utility, okay, and you need more generating power, it might be difficult to convince someone to build an electric generating plant for you because it is highly specific to a very particular location, in which case you might have to build it yourself, right? Okay. The other example is physical asset specificity, right? And that can be customized software or equipment, something that's tailored to do a very specific thing. Okay. Now, the reason that asset specificity may wind up resulting in vertical integration is that asset specificity itself is kind of a red flag between two parties. Okay, if it's something that's very specific, it indicates that a long-term contract might be necessary for those two parties with lots of protections in place for both of them. Again, a specific asset one firm can't do anything else with it, and the other firm absolutely needs it as an input. Right? In that case, it may just simply be more economical to integrate or to merge. Okay, but now I want to talk about number 3 on this list, and that's global scope. This is a question of where a firm is going to compete, and the things to consider here are distance. That's going to be the defining metric. And as I hinted in the lecture on vertical and horizontal scope, yes, this is partially physical distance, but another portion of this is cultural distance, and we're going to get into both of those. But before we do that, we need to get clear on some definition of terms that I'm sure you've heard, but I want to make sure they're clear. But then I also want to highlight some potential motivations or reasons for even going abroad. Okay, international strategy. This is somewhat straightforward, but it's simply the strategy by which a firm is selling its goods outside of its home market. Globalization is a term that has become somewhat loaded, but in the context of what we are talking about in this lecture, it's the process of closer integration and exchanges between different countries and people worldwide, which are made possible by falling trade and investment barriers. It's worth there just for a second to think about PESTLE and what are the macro environmental factors that have helped lower the barriers to entry into other countries, but also what kind of qualities might make it possible for certain organizations to globalize faster than others. The last one on this slide is national advantage, and that's simply when one nation's opportunity cost of producing an item is less than that of another nation. That could be for a variety of factors, some of which we will touch upon. But also imagine for a second what that could potentially mean for how certain companies think about expanding their global scope. Okay. A multinational enterprise, that's just a company that makes and distributes products to at least 2 countries. And lastly, foreign direct investment. And here I am specifically talking about firms. When a company makes investment in value chain activities away from the home country of operations. So, for example, Toyota building a car manufacturing plant in Ohio is foreign direct investment. Okay. A clothing company like Benetton having another company create clothes in Bangladesh, that's not necessarily FDI. That is often outsourcing. Okay. But in trying to understand the basis for operating globally, here are 5 questions that we want to try to answer. Okay? Why go abroad? How to expand? Who has certain advantages? How to compete abroad? And where to expand. Where to expand may end up being part 2 of a lecture, depending on how things go. So, why go abroad? Maybe many reasons, but there are 3 big ones. Larger markets, cheaper resources and new competencies. Let's take each of these in turn. Larger markets can give you economies and scale and scope. Okay. And it's also possible that you have weak or limited home markets. Right? In order to hit scale or scope economies, you need to have a sufficiently large customer base. For some companies, their home market is sufficient. Okay? Walmart, for example, was able to get to scale economies within the United States because the United States economy is so large. And expanding beyond the US, it's using its already built up scale advantages to other markets. Some companies, however, their home market is too small for scale or scope economies to take over. Zara is based out of Spain. Its fast fashion concept relies on economies of scale to keep costs manageable. But if it only sold clothes in Spain, it would probably not have a big enough market to reach scale. So the only way that its business works is if it sells clothes beyond its home market. The second point is cheaper resources and inputs. In the early days of globalization, this meant access to cheaper materials like lumber and natural gas. However, in the later part of the 20th century and the 21st century, this increasingly means access to lower labor costs. And this is both at the high-end service jobs like accounting and coding, as well as manufacturing jobs like textiles, for example, from Prada to Gucci to Benetton have their clothes made in Bangladesh. The third thing is new competencies, and that takes the form of clusters and location economies. You may simply want to go abroad because you can benefit from simply being located in the same areas as companies that do similar things. For example, think to yourself what industries Boston is known for. All right. If you're thinking healthcare and biotech, you're right in the money. Well, keep in mind that people are social. And when lots of companies are co-located, people talk about work, and through informal networks that are created, some skills can be disseminated, but it can also be the basis for people moving between organizations. These are examples of spillovers. Right? Then there are location advantages. Because of tricks of history, some places are simply the places to be for certain industries. So by setting up shop near these places, you can take advantage of potential value chain benefits of being there. If you wanted to build high-performance motors, for example, setting up shop in the Lombardy region of Italy might be a good idea. If you ever do a case on Ducati, you'll understand why. That's where Ducati, the high-performance motorbike company, is set up. Okay. But there are, of course, challenges as well in going abroad. Okay. You might have to think about why labor costs in a particular place are low. Okay. It might be because workers are working crazy long hours for questionable pay, and that takes a toll on them psychologically. Apple clearly found this out the hard way with some of the challenges from Foxconn in 2010. Okay. Another reason the costs might be low abroad is because they operate in a country with a potentially weak safety inspection regime. In 2013, Rana Plaza, a building outside of Dhaka in Bangladesh, collapsed, killing over 200 people. Companies including Gucci, Benetton, Prada, JCPenney, and Joe Fresh all source clothes from this factory. Now, you, as a manager of a multinational company, you should be first worried about these things because being involved with companies who treat their workers poorly is morally and ethically problematic. Beyond that, there is consideration to take into account that these kind of problems can potentially permanently damage your brand and reputation. Another challenge is that cost advantages are not necessarily permanent. By increasing economic opportunities in a country, by situating new production there, the economy there increases in size, the country gains competency in new industries, new businesses get created, and the competitiveness of the country goes up, and by extension, the cost of labor there increases, and the cost advantage that you enjoyed being abroad erodes. Now, the hope is that as countries develop by having more production, people there will eventually be able to be consumers and not just producers. As their wages increase, they can start to be consumers of the things that they make. But that's not instantaneous or even assured. All right. Apple still has challenges getting into China because unlike the US, not every other place in the country has lots of people that are willing to spend the equivalent of $1,200 on a phone. Okay, now that we have a sense of why you might go global and what the risks might be, the question is how. And that really kind of depends. At one end of the spectrum, you have low control, and at the other end, you have high control. Another thing to consider is that at one end, you have faster entry, and at the other end, you have slower entry into the new market. Exporting is further to the left, and that's simply finding someone to sell your stuff in another country. That's generally pretty quick, but you don't have much control over how your product is being sold in that place. Licensing is when you allow another company to make your product with your brand on it, and that gives you a little bit more control. For example, in the US, Though the product says Cadbury on it, if you buy it in most stores in the US, the Cadbury product is actually made by Hershey, as Hershey is licensed to make Cadbury products in the US. Franchising gives you a bit more control, just like franchising here in the US does. All right, franchising is when basically a company, in this case a franchisor, allows you use of their production methods and logos to sell their products. McDonald's is one that you're probably most familiar with. Okay? In the US, most McDonald's are franchises. They're not run by McDonald's. Some entrepreneur has paid McDonald's a hefty upfront fee and then an ongoing royalty fee to be able to sell hamburgers and fries the McDonald way to people. Okay? Then we get to a higher level of control. Joint ventures are when you partner with a local company, in this case, a local company in the country to which you want to expand. They manufacture the good. And in some countries, you're actually required to do this in certain industries. You have to partner with a local company. All right. Now, everything on the other side of this line are things that give you the most control because they're inside the boundary of the firm. Acquisitions can sometimes be quick, all right, but regulatory hurdles can make this time-consuming, especially depending on the country. Right, but that is one way you can enter a new country. And then, of course, you can simply build out the international division from scratch. And that's going to be the slowest one of all. The reason that you would go to one side or the other depends on certain things, like, do you have intellectual property that is really important? Well, then maybe you want to build out a new division. Okay? Also, the higher control side has potential for greater returns. Okay? Then it's also a question of how much local expertise you need to sell your products. The more local expertise you need, the more you're going to need to be toward the right side of this divide. Okay. All right. Now, at this point, some of you are thinking, wow, Prof D, that was a really long-winded explanation. Okay. And that's fine, but I summarized a ton of the reading for you, so you're welcome. Now, some of the rest of you have probably noticed that this arrow looks familiar, and it should. It lines up almost precisely with the vertical integration arrow, and the overlaps are similar. The main thing to take away is that both have to deal with how much control you need to have over the activity of the division. If you need to have great control over the process, then the process simply needs to be within the boundary of the firm or in-house. Okay. All right. The next question is the who. Who has certain advantages? But there's another way I want you to think about this question, and that is, why was Nokia born in Finland? Keep that in mind as we go forward. This framework is from Porter to try to help understand why certain countries might be more competitive in some industries as compared to other countries. Now, the diagram in the reading, if you did the reading, which I understand right now, things are a little, things be challenging, and you may not have gotten to it. Don't stress about that. I try to explain these things as well as I can in these videos, just to make sure that you get this stuff. Okay. Anyways, now the diagram that you saw in the reading might not have had chance or government in it, but as we go through these slides, think of the ways that chance and government play a role in this structure. All right, so first we have firm strategy. All right, the key takeaway here is that if you have a lot of fierce competition in your home market, you on average tend to outperform other companies that don't have as much competition. Germany has lots of competitors. It has a super fast highway and high gas prices. Okay, if you're going to make cars in that space, you have to be really good at it. Right? And that's one of the reasons that German cars can compete so strongly abroad. Right? By extension, you might also think about what kind of national factors might be playing a role in American cars' general lack of competitiveness. Something to think about. Okay. Then there are factor conditions. These are endowments in terms of national, human, and other resources, and they can be natural or produced. All right. So what are we looking at here? The first picture shows you some of the properties of Saudi Aramco. One of the largest companies in the world exists in part simply by chance of the massive fossil fuel reserves that sit in Saudi Arabia. All right. Other national resources? Well, have any of you ever wondered why Hollywood is where it is? Oh, well, it's there because there was great weather, lots of different natural environments, which would be good for doing lots of different films, and at the time the studios were being set up, the land was really cheap. Okay? It made it very easy for the film industry to get started there. Okay? These kind of resources are impacted by chance. Okay? It's just how the distribution of resources across the planet worked out. Okay? But resources can also be produced. Countries with good capital markets or that have extensive university systems can also have an advantage. Silicon Valley in California and Route 128 in Massachusetts have been tech hubs in part because of their proximity to universities. Right? This is an example of how governments can play a role, either by directly helping to create universities like the land grant system, or indirectly by like the tax-exempt status of universities. Those are different ways the government can actually help create certain factor conditions. Okay. So things like talent, career opportunities, capital, weather condition, national environments, cost of land, these are all things that can combine in terms of factor conditions that can give countries certain advantages in certain industries. Okay. Then there are demand conditions. Certain countries have characteristics that have led to customers with very specific demands. Okay? And this is why Nokia was born in Finland. Finland is rural and sparse. It's beautiful, but super rural. All right? So wireline communications never fully took off. Right? We see telephone wires everywhere in the United States. It never really took off in Finland. Okay? But wireless was ideally suited to meet Finland's specific needs. Hence, there became a quick demand for non-wired communication. Okay. Porter's diamond can also be useful in helping to see that there might be particular business advantages for places. And so in this way, you might see that Porter's diamond can be prospective. By thinking about what are the specific demand conditions that are likely to arise in an area, it can give an indication of what kind of industries might be successful in a country. Okay? Many quote-unquote third world countries jumped straight to cell phones by passing wireline communication completely, largely because infrastructure is expensive to build. All right? Also, banks are a kind of infrastructure that is hard to build, but they're necessary. But very necessary. All right, put those kind of two things together. These kind of countries might be specifically good breeding grounds for practical mobile phone-based banking solutions. Okay, so if you think about the demand conditions of a specific country, it can tell you more than just what kind of advantage it might have. It can tell you what kind of industries have the chance to grow there if you want to start them. Got the picture. Good picture. Okay. Lastly, there are supporting industry or complements. We've talked about complements before. Okay. The idea is that some industries can support competitive advantage in other industries. For example, having great engineering and IT companies in Germany can help support the competitiveness of German car companies. In this example of complements, good engineers and solid IT infrastructure can help create more robust value chains for German car companies. Okay. Also, you can look at it from a downstream standpoint. Switzerland had early success with chemical manufacturing. Okay. And because of this, it helped them to gain a foothold in developing a pharmaceutical industry. However, This is in no way assured. Being good in an upstream thing does not necessarily mean that you can immediately move downstream. Okay? For example, all of the cacao in the world is grown in the global south, in the tropics, okay? But just about all the chocolate manufacturers are in the global north, all right? So that's why the can is underlined. Being good at one thing can have downstream effects, just not guaranteed. Okay. One big consequence of thinking about the world in terms of Porter's diamonds means that you might get industry clusters in certain parts of the world. Right? Think of it like this. High rivalry can lead to innovation. Then you can have certain factor conditions nearby, like universities. Beyond the focal industry, this can result in supporting industries being created around the focal industry. Okay? The second order consequence of this is that people discuss work in informal settings, and that results in knowledge spillovers. But then people also move in between firms, and this creates intra-firm networks. Right? The end result of all this is that you get these tight clusters of firms in certain areas. Okay? Again, rivalry leads to innovation. You may have factor conditions created by government like universities. Okay, you can get support industries around the focal industry, and then you can get these intra-firm networks. This results in tight clusters of firms in certain areas. Finance in New York, fashion in Milan, biotech in Boston, North Carolina, and of course, technology in Silicon Valley. A well-developed concentration of related businesses spurs three important activities. Increased productivity, because you have specialized inputs, access to information, synergies, and access to public goods. More rapid innovation, right? These firms can have cooperative research, okay? And new business formation. As new firms fill in niches and expand to the boundaries of the clustering in the area. Okay, so how to compete abroad. All right. So there are kind of four basic strategies to going abroad, and that's because of two things. Okay. First and foremost, the reason that companies go abroad is to enjoy reductions in costs, i.e. they achieve economies of scale and scope, and that's on the y-axis. Okay. Now, while there is some convergence in taste for products and demand, there are still distinct local styles and cultures for certain products. And so the x-axis represents the extent to which a company has to tailor its products to local tastes and need. Okay? And so you end up with this 2x2 grid, all right, where you have the low need for local responsiveness but a high pressure local cost. You get global standardization. When you have low pressure to lower cost and a low need for local responsiveness, you get sort of international, right? And basically the way that people go abroad in that case is exporting and franchising, okay? Low pressure to cost, but high local pressure, well, that's when you do licensing and joint ventures, right? But if you have a high pressure to local costs and a high need for local responsiveness, that's when you have a transnational corporation, okay? And then basically you either need to do a greenfield, you create a new venture, that's what greenfield means, or you do an acquisition. All right, I'll take each of these a turn and I'll give you some examples. All right, the quote-unquote international strategy is one of the simplest. It's just selling your product as is, but in a different market. Okay, it works well when there's a high willingness to pay for the product, and one of the main attractions is the culture surrounding the product. Okay. People don't want a Harley Davidson just because it's a motorcycle. They want it because it's a Harley, okay? People want a Rolex because it symbolizes luxury. You can look at the Rolex and you can see that second hand sweeping along the face of the watch and you know it's quality, okay? This stands in contrast with a localization strategy. In this case, the willingness to pay for the product is still there, but there are local tastes or idiosyncratic preferences at play that will often be the case for food products. Okay? So if you are selling luxury items or where culture matters, then you're going to do sort of an exporting or a franchising type style. You're just going to take the product as is and sell it, usually, okay? If you have minimal cost concerns because people are willing to pay for your product, but there's high local pressure in terms of tastes, then you're going to want to do something like licensing, JV, or maybe set up a division, a unique division there. The idea being that you have to find some things out about the local tastes in order to make your product, okay? And from connecting this back to organizational structure, these companies that do this kind of thing typically have more simple organizational structures. They are often functional or divisional structures. I'll show you more detail on that soon. Okay. Then we have global standardization. This is for companies that face high cost pressure but relatively small localization pressure. This is essentially companies looking for the best possible cost position and is often fostered by companies for whom economies of scale or cost leadership is crucial to their worldwide operations. Often this is the case for people that manufacture commodity products like PCs. Okay? And if you have high cost pressure, all right, you're probably looking to either acquire someone locally or, build out a new division or a JV. As you can kind of see, the cost pressure pushes you closer to being within the boundaries of the firm. Okay. The last strategy is transnational. And if you've ever heard the phrase think globally, act locally, that is a company pursuing a transnational strategy. All right. These are companies that both face some level of cost pressure, but the kinds of products they sell also face pressure from local preferences. Large consumer product multinationals such as Coke and Procter & Gamble are face these kinds of pressures. Okay, one of the ways this manifests itself is in product lines that you've never heard of that these companies make if you're in the US. Okay, I'm going to go out on a limb and say that most of you have not heard of this milk drink from Coke, okay, or this Pro Series shampoo, all right? But these are Coke and Procter & Gamble's respective entries into the Indian market, all right? And to connect this back to the organizational structure lecture, if you're going to pursue a transnational strategy, you usually have a matrix organization where one of the dimensions of the organization is the country level, okay? And to follow up more on the topic of organizational structure, see Harley-David leadership. This is a very functional organization. Even though they do sell their products in foreign markets, it's a relatively simple international strategy that does not require a complex level of organization. Remember, you only want to do a complex organizational structure if there's no other way to execute your strategy. Okay, by extension. This is why Procter & Gamble's structure is much more complex. If you look at the titles, you can see that this is clearly a matrix organization that is pursuing a transnational strategy. This is evidenced by the fact that you have presidents that are in charge of product segments like global healthcare and global grooming. Okay, but then you also have presidents that are in charge of areas. Like there's a president of Europe, a president of Latin America, president of what? Is there a president? You're president of Greater China. Okay. The challenge with this structure is that while it helps manage potential complexity, it is expensive, both because of all the duplicated resources, but it can also be a little bit clunky to get things done. Because if you want to, say, introduce a new razor into China, all right, well, you need to bring both the president of global grooming and the president of Greater China into agreement in the strategy. So P&G actually changed its structure, right, getting rid of most of the country presidents and instead just having people in charge of products. They said that part of the reason is that they did this is so they could be more responsive to changing in markets, okay? The other part of it is that the costs were getting high and they weren't really growing. All right, remember what I said. Yes, a matrix organization structure allows you to deal with more complex environments, okay? But it's also expensive, okay? And those extra costs were weighing on the company. They weren't growing, and that attracted the ire of an activist shareholder named Nelson Peltz, who encouraged them to streamline the company in an effort to save costs. What you can see from this is that the transnational strategy is great if you can make it work, but it's very challenging even for a 100-plus-year-old company like Procter & Gamble to get it right. Okay. Thank you for your time on this slide, and not just this slide, but the whole lecture, and I look forward to seeing you for part 2.